Decade anniversary of when France's biggest bank, BNP Paribas, froze $2.2 billion worth of funds, citing U.S. subprime mortgage instability. This article is from 2007. So 10 years later, have we learned from the mistakes that tanked the global economy? And is the global economy back on track? Joining me to discuss from London is economist Steve Keen, author of Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? Steve, thanks for being here. I wanted to first get your take, 10 years on. What's your take on the health of the global economy today?
It's basically, if you can imagine the financial crisis like being attacked by zombies, then we're still in the state of the walking dead. We haven't got rid of the fundamental cause. It hasn't even been identified, of course, by the people supposedly in charge of the global economy. So we're still carrying the legacy, much in the same way that Japan has carried the legacy of its financial crisis from 1990 right through for a quarter of a century.
What signs did you see leading up to the crash that most of the mainstream economists either missed or ignored?
Very good question. I look at the level of private debt and how fast it's growing. And those two factors are completely ignored by the mainstream because they treat debt as simply a transfer from one person to another. So one person's spending power increases, the other doesn't, the other falls. It's like a seesaw. The seesaw remains at the same height according to their false model of banking. And because I've always been a critic of that model, I regard the level of debt as an indicator of pressure on the economy, and level of credit as a source of demand, which can turn negative if people go from borrowing money to paying debt down, which is precisely what I saw starting, first of all, too much credit driving too much demand from 1993 through to 2007. And then from 2007, I could see that the level of debt was going to fall dramatically, which it did. It went from being plus 15% of GDP to minus 6% from 2008 to 2010. That was completely ignored by the mainstream. That's why they didn't see it coming, and they're still not even looking at it one decade after the crisis occurred.
Right. So, Steve, I want to look at it right now because in the United States, we're seeing some of the highest levels of private debt in the U.S. since the Great Depression. What do you think it'll take us to fully recover? Because this is a chart that you gave us, and it looks like it's starting to rise back up from the highest peak at the Great Recession.
It is rising again, but of course a bit like if you climb Mount Everest and you go back down to the base camp below the summit, you've only got the summit to climb back up to again. And in many ways, because that is the highest level of private debt that America has ever carried, I certainly can't see it getting much past that 170% level. That means whatever credit-based demand the economy has right now will at some point in the next couple of years reach zero and possibly go negative once more. And this is the situation Japan has been in for a quarter of a century, of having a bit of a revival with a bit of growth in credit, but still having far too high a level of private debt. They haven't delevered sufficiently. America's now caught in the same situation, and I expect it'll repeat the same pattern until something as life-threatening as the Second World War comes along and generates the level of government spending that's necessary to reduce the level of private debt.
Well, let's take this opportunity then to look at the global scale of private debt, because China's line is on a steep incline, along with a couple of other countries, but I think that China shows like the highest raise right there. You can see at the very top, Japan has been chaotic from, like you said, their crisis from decades ago. Do the levels that we see on a global scale worry you?
Yes, America and the UK and Europe are all most of them are in the post-crisis period, so they've got a high level of debt for which they're either rising very slowly or actually falling. But the countries like China, South Korea, Canada, Australia and Belgium that I've identified on that chart, and a number of others, have got rising levels of private debt and more private debt than they had back when the global financial crisis hit a decade ago. So they're going to also face that same slowdown in debt growth and then finally negative credit. And when that happens, they'll have their own mini financial crises. They won't be on the same scale as the American because none of them are anything like that scale of the size of the economy, though China, of course, is very large. So when that hits, it'll affect the rest of the world in a flow-on effect. So we are going to see another crisis spread across a large number of countries over the next 1 to 3 years.
Well, you said yourself that the biggest indicator for you was this measure of private debt and that it was something that mainstream economists missed. have those economists learn from their mistakes? Are they starting to take a look at this like you are?
No. No. It's as likely that they'll look at this issue as that somebody who's a believer in Jesus Christ as God will read the text of Buddha. They are so completely divorced from that way of thinking. Joe Stiglitz, for example, who's one of the most progressive mainstream economists and somebody I've met and quite like, had a lengthy presentation he gave a few weeks ago. Not one slide of about 35 was devoted to the level of debt or the level of credit. They are still completely blind to this cause because it simply doesn't fit their intellectual framework.
Is there something that the governments and the financial industries could do to prevent it from happening again, even if the economists aren't seeing the signs?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, that's one reason I've talked about the level of government spending as well. Politicians are obsessed about treating the government like a household and thinking it should save more than it spends. In the aggregate, that's impossible because one person's spending becomes somebody else's income. In the aggregate, expenditure is income. So if the government decides to cut spending and run a surplus, it actually makes the situation worse. It reduces income for everybody. So what the government should do now, because it's not constrained by the lack of money, the government can actually create its own money. Government spending could be used to effectively help reduce the level of private debt. And that's what we did indirectly through the Second World War. Strangely, in terms of its economic impact, the main economic impact of the Second World War was to drastically reduce the level of private debt because so much government money was devoted to fighting the Nazis and fighting the Japanese that the private sector could do little else but pay its level of debt down. So we began the post-war period with the lowest level of private debt in America's case for over almost a century, and that gave a tremendous impetus to the economy. It wasn't debt constrained, and in fact credit growth could stimulate demand and stimulate innovation as well. We need to get back to that situation so the government can do it, but again, given that it's being advised by mainstream economists, I don't expect them to do it.
Steve Keen, economist and author of Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? Thank you so much for your time.